We're basically finished with the sign up page. Now we're going to move over to the login page. Now this isn't as sophisticated as the sign up form. We're not going to have anything added to the end, any icon added to the end to indicate whether an input's valid or not. But we are still going to do validation. So we'll start by going over to login. We'll go to the login page and we're going to import once again use form from React Hook form, and we'll use that up at the top. And we want to get back register and handle submit. So we're going to add an on submit to the form, and we're going to pass on submit our own on submit function to handle submit here, and we'll just create that. On submit, it's going to accept data. You can just console log it. And again, to be explicit, we can add the mode of on blur for use form. And additionally, for each of the text fields, we're going to provide that input ref and add register. For username, for what we're calling our username field for now, register is going to accept, first of all, required, set to true, and min length of 5. Now we're going to change the label. Instead of it being just username, instead of it only accepting username data, we're going to say username, email, or phone. That's actually what the real Instagram app accepts. It allows you to input your phone number, username, or email. So we want to enable all those options too. Then for password, we'll add input ref and for it set it to required and the min length of 5 as well. Now note that for the password, when you start typing, you have this little show button at the end. This is what we're going to use as the end adornment, and it's going to enable users to take a look at their password. So it's going to allow us to change the type of the input from password to text. So let's set that up now, and this is going to require us to use input props once again. We'll add end adornment, and we're going to need an input adornment component which will wrap a button and this button is going to have either the text hide or show. So right now we'll just set that to show to see that it shows up correctly. And we want to be able to toggle this. So we need some state that's going to keep track of whether we're showing our password or not. So we'll make a state that will initially be false, and this will be called show password, and the setter will be set password. We can be even more explicit. We could call it set password visibility if we wanted. And we'll make a function that will allow us to toggle password visibility. And this is just going to use the setter and set it to its opposite value, opposite of the previous value. Now, how are we going to be able to determine when we actually have something typed into the input? Well, another useful method that React Hook Form exposes is one called watch. So if we go back to the API documentation, there's a function called watch where we can just pass in the name of the input to it, and it's going to give us the value of it at that point in time. It subscribes to the value that's typed in. So we can destructure watch. Now, we haven't provided name values for any of these text fields, but we might as well go ahead and do that. So for the first one that accepts the username, email, or phone, we'll set the name here to just input. And then for the second one, we'll set the name to password. So how are we going to detect whether we actually have a password? Well, up at the top, we can use watch, pass it the string password. And since this is going to give us the real-time value that was typed in the password input, we can convert this to a Boolean value, and we can put the result in a variable called hasPassword. So only when we actually have typed a password here do we want to show this button. So first of all, we'll add a conditional around end adornment. If hasPassword is true, then we're going to show that adornment with the button. And for the text, we'll add a conditional based on the value of show password. If a user is wanting to show the password, we'll set the text to hide. And if not, it'll be set to show. And then for the type, we mentioned changing that. If show password is true, that'll be set to text, otherwise password, which will make it hidden. And then if we click on this button, for the on click, we want to toggle the password visibility. So only when we type in here do we see the button, and we can toggle it appropriately. Now, we also might want to do the same thing that we did in sign up, which is grab the form state from the use form hook, which will give us those two values to disable the submit button. So let's find the submit button at the very end of the form, and we'll make it disabled if not form state dot is valid, if it's not valid, or if form state dot is submitting. So again, if the form's not valid, if one of the inputs isn't valid, our button's going to be disabled. So let's make the username value invalid. See, it's still disabled, but if we provide 5 characters, we can attempt to log in. Now the next step will be to actually try to log in with an existing user's email. We're going to see in just a bit how to, if a user provides just their username, log them in successfully as well. But the way that this works with Firebase, let's head back to auth.js. The way that this works with Firebase is that, similar to how we have a sign up with email and password function that calls this create user with email and password method, we're going to need to create another method that allows us to log in with that existing user, again using the email and password. So let's create login with email and password. And we could pass in the form data if we wanted to. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide 2 separate arguments, one for the email and one for the password here. So here we're going to call await firebase.auth, and this method that we'll use will be called sign in with email and password. And email passes the first argument, or passes the first argument, and password provided as the second. And we can get back our data, which is the user that we're logging in, and return that if we need it. So next, we remember that we need to pass this down to our provider to make this available in our components. We can head back to login, and then we can destructure the context that we're reading from the auth context and grab login with email and password, and then call it. We can again make this an async function and await the result. Then we'll pass in data.email, or rather this is going to be data.input and data.password. And if we like to make this even simpler, we could just go ahead and destructure the two values according to the text field names input and password. And I think that's a bit more straightforward. So again, we want to await that, and again, we can use the history hook, use history hook to get history, and then push to the root route to just /. So let's go ahead and make sure that this works. And it looks like I added an extra unneeded parenthesis in parameters of onSubmit. Now let's try logging in with an existing user. And we're taken to the home page. That's good. We can go and log out. So that's successful. But now the next thing that we want to do is allow the user to provide their username or their phone number even. So how are we going to do that? Well, we want to allow users to provide whatever input they want, you know, their username, email, or password. But what we can do is we can check to see if that provided input is an email with the help of something we're already familiar with, that is email function. So we can just copy that import from validator, bring it into login, and then up at the top of our onSubmit, we can check and see if the result of calling is email against our input. If it's not an email, then what we can do is we can do a lookup. We can attempt to get the user's email based off of what they provided, their username or password, presumably. So we're going to need to write a query here that's going to allow us to search for user's email based on either their username or phone number. So we're going to head back to our graphical console and write this query. And this is going to be a user's query where, and we're going to use the OR operator to check to see if the value provided on the input is either a username is equal to a username. So we'll use the equals operator. We'll select username and then the EQ operator, and then also the phone number and the EQ operator. Now, the way that this is written automatically isn't correct. If you look at the Hasura documentation and look more at the OR operator, you'll note that what it accepts has to be provided as an array. So in this entire object here, we're going to need to surround it with an array, just like that. And we can add in the return, we can return here the email, because that's what we want. So now we can finish writing this. We'll call our query get user email, and we're going to accept an input. We're going to have an input variable. It's going to be a string and required, and it's going to be passed both to the username, the EQ operator for the username, and for the phone number. So let's take all this and head to queries, and we're going to export const get user email and paste in the result. And we can run this, if we wanted to, we can run this in the console. We can set the input to an existing user. So make sure that you run your query and you get the expected result. I didn't write it out everything exactly as it should. Make sure it looks exactly like this, where everything is provided within this array, where the username is equal to the input or the phone number is equal to the input, and see that you actually get the email for a valid user. Okay, so let's copy this one more time and paste it in here. And then back in login, we will once again use Apollo client to execute our query. So we'll import that, and we're going to get the client, and we're going to execute a separate function here, and this is going to be called get user email logically, and it's going to accept the input. So we'll create that underneath, and this will be an async function. Get user email. It's going to get our input, and this is where we're going to take care of executing our query. We're going to await client.query, and then to the query property we'll provide get user email and import that. Then we'll add our variables array, our variables object. We'll provide input as the property and value to variables here. And we're going to get back our response, and we'll take a look at that. We'll console log the response here, and we're going to make sure to await the result of get user email. Now the goal is that we want to take the response, and if it's a valid input, we want to return from the response the email from this function and pass it along to log in with email and password. So right now I'm just going to comment out these last two lines here, and we're going to execute get user email, and we're going to provide a value that is the username for our one user, or you might have signed up multiple users, and we'll hit login, and we get back a response, and in it we see response data users, and we have an array where we're only getting one result back, so it's always going to be in the 0th index of that array, and then from it we get the email. So we can, if you're using Chrome, you can highlight the 0 here, and you can copy this entire property path. Actually, we can highlight email and copy that path, because that's what we want to get back. So now we can put provide a variable for the user email, and it might not be possible to get the 0th element here if it's an empty array, so we want to add a question mark after it. And we're going to get the email if we actually have one element there. Otherwise, we want to provide some dummy email, such as noemail.com. And this is going to return an error from Firebase, prompting them to provide some actual user credentials. But this is what we want to return from this function, user email. And what we're going to do here is we're going to overwrite the input value that's being passed to this function. So if we provide, say, user 10 here as the input, it's going to be overwritten later on with the actual email result from the query user10@gmail.com. And then we can continue on with the rest of the login process. So let's save that and make sure that this works. So let's say user10 with the password and log in. And note that sometimes there's a problem with getting the push operation to happen immediately after the await. When we're awaiting login with email and password, I just use a set timeout, wrap it in a set timeout with a value with a time period of 0 milliseconds. And that's going to make sure it executes immediately after our logging in with email and password. Let's try that again. And we log in, and we're taken to the home page. Great. So now, what else remains to be done? Well, we're not handling any authentication errors. So if the password's too short, or if the password's not valid, we haven't handled the case for if we don't have a valid password. What's going to happen? Well, we're going to get an uncaught promise again. So this is another case where we want to import our auth error. So let's import auth error, and that's going to come from, we might have to import it manually from our sign up page. From /sign up, and we want to use it right at the bottom of our form, and we'll provide that right underneath our login with Facebook button. So we have our auth error, but once again we need to pass something to the error prop. So let's create some error state. We're going about this a little bit backwards, but let's do the same thing that we did in sign up. We'll grab some error state, and we'll handle the error once again within our onSubmit. We'll wrap everything there within a try catch. And at the beginning, we'll set the error to an empty string like we did before. And we're going to catch any errors. And here we're going to console error with the message error logging in, pass through the error object. And once again, we want to use a handle error function, pass through the entire object, and we can grab that function from sign up. So since we're doing a login operation, we're not going to have an error related to attempting to take a username. We're not trying to create an account, but we will have one error. We know of at least one error regarding authentication, and that's going to come from Firebase. So we can just use we can just provide one condition for this if statement. We can add other conditions in the future if we come across them, but they're basically all going to come from Firebase telling us something like you provided the wrong password or something like that. So if we try logging in with the username, we get the error message provided to us. And let's also make sure that we don't have the ability to edit a user's phone number just yet, but let's take one of them and manually change their phone number to something valid, to some random phone number, and make sure that we can log in with that. Not for the password, but and we can still log in as if we were providing our email too. Now the next step, and I believe the final step of authentication here, is going to be logging in with Facebook, logging in with a third-party provider. So it's pretty easy to set that up with Firebase. This is really the advantage of using it. And what we can do is we can head to authentication, and we can go to sign in method and select, I'm personally going to use Google. It's very easy to do Facebook if you want to keep it very close to the actual Instagram application, but I'm going to use Google here. And all you really need to do is you just need to provide a project support email and enable it. And there might be a little bit more configuration that I might have overlooked, but we'll just try this for now. We'll hit save, and we need to create another method within our auth file, and this is, well, actually we've kind of already created it. This is sign in with Google. Let's call this login with Google instead. Just to keep things consistent. And for logging in with Google, this is going to require a little work. Let's first make sure that we can get back our data from this operation. Let's see if this works successfully, and we'll go from there. Let's save this, and we're going to use this specifically within the button component, the login with Facebook component here. And here too, we're going to use context with auth context, and we're going to grab login with Google, and we're going to add to the button and on click, and it's going to be set to a function handle login with Google. Again, we're going to be doing some error handling. This will be an async function. It's not going to accept anything, but we'll set up a try catch, and we'll use the same console error logging in with Google, pass through the error object, and we're actually going to have an error message here if necessary. If there isn't one, we'll create the same error piece of state, the setter set error. So we'll set an error using error.message, and the error is going to show up at the very bottom. So again, we're going to use auth error. We'll wrap everything that we're returning in a fragment, and under the button we'll add auth error and pass through the error value and state. And I just want to make sure that we did that for the component above, and we did. Okay, so actually what we want to perform when we're using this handle login with Google function is we want to await login with Google. Pretty straightforward. So here let's select login with Facebook. And great, we can choose an account to log in with. So let's try doing that. One I'm already logged in with. Let's see if I get data back, and I do. Perfect. So a new user's been created, and it contains the typical stuff. Additional user info is new user is set to true here. And if we look at user, we can see all of our information like display name, the email. If we scroll down, we'll see the UID. So a lot of stuff, and there's also a photo URL associated with it, so we don't have to use a default user image. We can use that in its place. So let's head to auth and finish this function here. We're going to again have the same check as we did for signing up. We're going to check data. If data.is additional info.is new user, if that's true, then we're going to run that same function, same mutation, create user, so we can copy this whole bit of code, but we're going to change things a bit. For this, instead of, we're going to keep the same user ID here, but we're not going to be getting stuff from form data, so we're going to need to find a way to create the name and the username. How are we going to do that? Well, here's how we're going to structure things. First of all, let's destructure data.user since we're going to be getting a lot of info from that. And first we'll grab UID. That's what we'll pass for user ID like before. Remember, display name, we can immediately provide that as the name. So we'll destructure display name for name. Now creating the username is going to be a little bit different because we want to make sure that this is unique. So how are we going to do that? Well, one way of making a semi-unique name, this isn't foolproof, but one approach that I've taken to doing is taking a combination of display name with the beginning of the user ID, or actually the end of the user ID, and combining those together to make the username itself. So let's try doing that. Let's make a username variable, and we'll use a template literal here. We'll interpolate display name, and we just want to remove all the white space. You can see for the current display name for the user that just signed up, there was some white space in it. We want to remove that. There's no white space in the username. So we'll use the replace method, and we'll pass in a regex, which will basically say, hey, just remove any spaces that you see throughout the string. This is what all of this says. Remove any white space till the end, and apply this globally. And replace that with just an empty string. And then at the very end, we'll combine onto it, or concatenate with it, the user ID, and we want to slice 5 characters from the end. So we can say slice -5. And that's what we'll provide as our new username. Now for the email, we can also destructure that from data.user. I'm writing this in the wrong, great, I'm writing this in the wrong function. So let me just copy this and then I will apply this to the login with Google function. Okay, much better. So we've got user ID name, username, email, bio and website we can leave empty. Same with phone number. Although it does have, note that there is a value from Firebase for phone number, but we haven't provided that. And then for profile image, we can grab the photo URL property from data.user. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save, and I will remove the user that I just signed up with in Firebase. So I'll delete them. I'll delete myself and then try this again. And this should work equally well from the sign up page. Log in with Google. And did I provide the wrong property? Yeah. Additional user info. Good to see that our error handling works. So we'll hit login with Facebook, actually through Google. If we look at data, it looks like we got back our new user, but I'm not seeing a user here. Oh, now I do. I see a new user here in our database. We see the username is a combination of the display name and the last few digits of the user ID. So that works successfully, but we're not redirecting. So that's one thing that we want to add. At the very end, we want to log in with Google, and then we also want to, once again, do a history.push to the feed page. Great. So at this point, we've basically taken care of all of our authentication related needs. And now we can really focus on the main pages, the meat of the application, which is the pages that will allow us to add posts, the feed itself, as well as the explore pages and profile pages.